Okay, it's 101 or 201. It's 101 my time. So let's get started. My name is Gabriel Lotto. I'm at the University of Texas. I'm the program manager for the MCS RCN. There are two acronyms that mean the Modeling Collaboratory for Subduction Zone Science Research Coordination Network. We are trying to build a modeling collaboratory, and we can talk more about what that means in the context of the SZ4D initiative that's going on right now, or that we're trying to build. This is an experimental webinar series, so thank you everyone for joining us. We are looking at both science and collaborations in subduction zone science, and figuring out kind of some big questions that need to be asked and answered, how collaborations toward modeling efforts enhance the science and answer questions. And we'll be exploring that today with three great speakers, Greg Hirth, Andy Freed, and Mark Behn. We will be in a conversation today, so hopefully you all can feel empowered in the audience to join in the conversation. You can type questions into the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to them. So really feel free to join in anytime. Just a couple other notes. This is our second webinar in the series. We have at least two more coming up this spring. You can go to our website, sd4dmcs.org, to check out the full details. And I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to our moderator and a member of the steering committee of the MCS-RCN, Mark Behn.
Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, I'm Mark Behn. I'm a faculty member at Boston College, where I've been for just a brief while. And so what we're going to talk about today is a collaboration that started actually back when I was at Woods Hole between myself and Andy Freed and Greg Hirth. Andy Freed is a geodynamicist who is a professor at Perdue University and has done a lot of really important work on thinking about post-seismic deformation after earthquakes and triggering of earthquakes associated with stress changes from post-seismic deformation. And Greg Hirth is a professor and also the chair of the Earth Environmental and Planetary Sciences Department at Brown, and he is an expert on rock physics, rock deformation, and does a lot of work on experiments. And I kind of fit more in the modeling category myself. And so the collaboration that we're going to talk about is kind of basically a project that we started trying to incorporate laboratory-derived physics and put that into numerical models to try to upscale the experiments that are done on the microscale into kind of lithospheric scale models of stress transfer. And so we'll talk throughout the webinar today about both the science in that study, as well as kind of some future directions that we're all thinking about and excited about, and hope that the modeling collaboratory moves in some of these directions, but also the ways that we started working together as a group, even given our somewhat disparate backgrounds. And so what I'd like to do is I'm going to first pass it off to Greg, who's going to talk a little bit about how this collaboration got kicked off, and then we'll kind of segue into some discussion on science with both Andy and Greg. So, and lastly, I will be monitoring the question and answer and chat windows below. And so if anyone has a question at any point, feel free to just type it in there, and I will make sure to pass that along, and we'll get that incorporated in the conversation. So maybe I will pass it over to Greg now.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks whoever's out there in the ether. So a couple of days ago, we were preparing for this, and I just jotted down my memory of how this all came about. And the key part of this was that Andy was coming to spend some sabbatical time at Woods Hole, and when he came, Mark and I had just finished working together on a paper on brain size evolution in the mantle, and its implications for understanding deformation mechanisms and seismic anisotropy. So the first thing that's key to this happening was getting people together for an extended period of time. And so, you know, the next thing that was key to this is that we have overlapping interests, but each bring a different strength to the table. So, you know, when Andy came, he had already written several papers exploring the application of experimental flow laws to explain viscoelasticity in the crust based on geodetic observations. And one of the things that he was really interested in looking into was transient creep. And the reason for that was, you know, he had this great data set, and he had explored already using the published steady state flow laws for crust and mantle rocks, and demonstrated that those didn't really explain the observations very well at face value. And so Mark's new grain size evolution model kind of gave us an avenue to try to look into that problem further, and see if we could get a self-consistent rheology model geodetic observation result out of that. So that was really fun. So, you know, coming from the lab, one of my biggest goals is always to say, well, we do an experiment on a piece of rock this big in a day or a week, and now we want to apply it to mantle convection or something, right? So that's a huge extrapolation in time and space. And what's really cool about the kind of stuff Andy does is it kind of meets you halfway. It's a response that you're measuring over years instead of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. And it's a scale, you know, from something bigger than an outcrop, but not an entire plate or something like that. So it's an intermediate scale and intermediate time. So when he was on sabbatical, Andy incorporated some of the modeling that Mark and I had worked on into kind of a composite model of viscoelasticity. And then he compared the predictions to what he sees by analyzing the geodetic data. And so reflecting, just kind of like off the top of my head, I was like, well, what was really cool about the collaboration? You know, one thing that was cool is that we were kind of challenging each other to push, you know, each other in how to apply what we know to a new problem. And then for me, what was exciting is that it worked. I guess that's the main thing that was cool. And so the big points that I took from it were that the magnitudes and directions of the GPS response indicated that post-seismic creep was dominantly occurring in the mantle at temperatures that were kind of high, like in the range of 1100 to 1200 degrees C, in depths of 50 to 70 kilometers. And that's a kind of a condition where we can actually get samples of rocks from xenoliths. And it's also a condition where our lab data are pretty well equipped to deal with predictions because we run the experiments at those same temperatures. So that's one extrapolation we don't have to worry about. And then the other cool thing was that guys like me, we often talk about these two different classes of deformation mechanism, diffusion creep versus dislocation creep. And one of them has a linear viscous response and the other one has a non-linear viscous response. So knowing which of these regimes you're in is really important for understanding not only the effective viscosity, but the conditions where you might anticipate seismic anisotropy to develop. And so the one thing that I was, you know, totally blown away by was that Andy's analysis really supported the dislocation creep mechanism, and combined with Mark's model of what the grain size should be, that was also consistent because it put us in the right ballpark, and that the best fitting kind of viscosity was low compared to steady state viscosity, which supported his earlier work. So I'll pass it over to Andy so he can go into a little bit more detail into what he did and how he did it and how he incorporated the kind of collaboration aspects of the project.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see You guys see my PDF?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, so this is this paper that we published in 2011, and I just want to. The paper really just quantifies everything that Greg just said. So I want to show you this figure. If you're not used to seeing post-seismic, this is a really cool data set. There was an earthquake in Landers in 1992 and Hector Mine in 1999, and those earthquakes stressed the lower crust and the upper mantle, and in the years afterwards, they relaxed and transferred that stress back to the surface. And that was recorded as a deformation of the surface by GPS receivers. And so the arrows you see there are actually cumulative GPS displacements over a 7-year period. And if you point out here's where Hector Mine and Landers are. In this particular model, what we were aiming to do actually is match the deformations way up here in Yucca Mountain area. Those GPS sites were all there, by the way, because we were gonna, I guess, bury some nuclear waste in the area, and they wanted to make sure it was tectonically stable. So our advantage, they had a lot of good instruments. What we found is that in order to explain post-seismic deformation way up there, it's only due to mantle flow. In fact, mantle flow below, I think, about 50 kilometers depth, which is really nice because usually post-seismic deformation is very complicated. There's afterslip, there's lower crustal deformation, there's mantle, there's poroelastic, there's a lot of contributions. And so by isolating the mantle contribution, by looking at this far field data, we're able to do a lot of things that we could never do before. So Greg mentioned about time series and fitting with steady state. So the gray lines here are the data. These are 4 stations, and these are just showing you transient deformation over 7 years. And you can see very rapid in the first year, extremely rapid displacements, and then they start smoothing out. And all of the black lines of the various sorts are simply models, both diffusion and dislocation models, where we applied flow laws. These were kind of the best we could do when we only considered steady state deformation. And even though we could fit cumulative deformation, we could not come close to explaining this transient response. So then we changed our constitutive relations to include transient deformation, and I'll just jump down to something like this one here. So this is now when we consider combined transient and steady state deformation for diffusion flow models. So just to remind you, these are models that are very sensitive to grain size, but not stress. And we can actually match, as you can see, kind of reasonably match the time series, but we couldn't match the deformation pattern. So that's what I'm showing here on the right. The white is the arrows. This is all just in the Yucca Mountain range. The white is the observed, and the others are the models. And those red arrows are as good as we could do, and they were systematically not such a great fit. Not terrible, but not such a great fit. And then we looked at dislocation models. That's what these show. These are very sensitive to either background strain rate and they're sensitive to stress, but not so much grain size. And again, with some of the models, we could fit using transient responses combined with steady state. We could fit the time series. And here's showing you the much better fit to the far field data in terms of actual direction of the displacements. By the way, the reason why it's very different between these two is because the stress dependence of dislocation flow localizes, it makes a very three-dimensional rheology compared to when it's not stress dependent, since you're not working with the stresses themselves so much of the co-seismic. It's a different distribution of viscosity. So this showed we could match time series, we could match far field displacements. It verified what we already thought, that dislocation creep is the dominant creep here, and that transient behavior is absolutely going on and necessary. And I'll pass this back to Greg for this figure 10. Stop share.
Right. All right. So here we are at figure 10. And so what this model is showing is, you know, if you look at the best fitting models that Andy produced, they would end up with an inferred stress like this and an inferred grain size if it's diffusion creep, or just a stress level if it's the dislocation creep. That's what you would get out for a temperature of like 1200 degrees C. So he gets a stress estimate, a grain size estimate of diffusion creep, but also we can predict a grain size from Mark's grain size model. And so Mark's grain size model plots along this line here. And for the inferred stress from Andy's model, xenoliths that come from this area that preserve temperatures of like 1200 degrees have this range of grain sizes. So what is this plot showing? The other thing it's showing is a boundary based on the lab data between the dislocation creep field of deformation and the diffusion creep field. So what you can see is increasing stress favors dislocation creep, increasing grain size favors dislocation creep. And the things that we pointed out were, while the diffusion creep model could work, the grain size that you would need for it to work actually plotted where you would predict dislocation creep would be the dominant mechanism. So there was some inconsistency there. At the same time, there was a positive correlation that Mark's grain size evolution model, which we call the watt meter here, actually predicts the grain size that you see from rocks from that area. So, you know, what I took from that was, wow, you know, we got together, we created a model that supported extrapolation of the laboratory data to the conditions where he was seeing the deformation. So to me then, you know, that was really, really cool, but it also made me ask a question of, okay, to make it work though, you still needed to have a transient viscosity that was much lower than the steady state viscosity, which is something that is likely for dislocation creep rheology. And there's some data that support kind of the magnitude, but as a lab scientist, it really challenged me to go back to the lab and think, how can we start constraining these things better? And it's been 10 years, Andy, but we have a student here at Brown who's actually doing exactly that, of doing transient creep experiments at these conditions. So maybe by the next time I see you, we'll be able to answer that question.
Hey, Greg, can I jump in?
Sure.
I've got a question from the audience here about the implications of the stress and strain conditions that we have for observations of seismic anisotropy in the area.
Yeah, so that's really important. So I mentioned briefly that seismic anisotropy is typically developed through relatively high strain deformation by dislocation creep mechanism. So the fact that Andy's model is putting us in a space where we'd expect dislocation creep to be the dominant deformation mechanism is consistent with the development of seismic anisotropy in that part of the mantle. And I'll just touch on kind of a related aspect of the xenoliths, and then just one other thing that maybe will be a good segue into some of the stuff you would talk about, Mark. Does that make sense?
Sure.
I guess, you know, maybe it's worthwhile in the kind of the reflecting back on this. One of the things that happens when you collaborate is sometimes you get a result that's consistent with what everyone has been saying, what each of us independently thought might be the answer. So one of the things that was really important for us, I think, was to challenge each other. And I really remember Andy saying, but Greg, those experiments, you know, you're doing them over a really short time. Can we really apply them? And, you know, slowly and surely, it was like, well, it looks like maybe we can, which was a cool result from that. At the same time, it still required us to ask another science question about transient creep, which is something that we're all really interested in still. So another figure to put this into context from my perspective is this paper that Whitney Bear worked on while she was a postdoc here at Brown. And so she was, these are xenoliths from the Sima volcanic field. And that is actually in the patch of mantle that the geodetic data were responding to. So the transient creep that Andy was measuring was actually cruising right through the nearby Sima volcanic field on its way over to deform Yucca Mountain. And so what Whitney looked at were peridotite xenoliths, and this is a thin section micrograph of one of those, and it shows a characteristic texture with these subgrain boundaries and recrystallized grains that are diagnostic of the dislocation creep process. And this, you know, this particular sample doesn't come from the depth where Andy's data were coming from, but rather just below the moho. But what's cool is that the flow law that is consistent with the viscosities estimated from the Sima volcanic field is consistent with the lab data, and is also consistent with the kind of range of viscosities required to see the response that Andy did. So that to me was nice, because you actually have a rock that came from the same place that is consistent with the analysis that we did. And I want to just kind of go over one other thing that, you know, in the application of lab data, you know, I mentioned this scaling issue to the post-seismic creep, and how, you know, to me, the post-seismic creep is just a great example of how to address scaling. But for me, the other way to do it is to look at rocks, similar to what Whitney had been doing. And I'll skip to this one just for time, to make sure we have other time for discussion. So another thing that Andy's results provided was kind of a bound on what the viscosity in the lower crust could be. And there's a lot of debate about viscosity contrast at the crust mantle boundary, and geodetic data are one way of looking at that. And another way is to look at rocks that are deformed at the lower crust. So you need to go to special places to find those rocks. And in this case, we went to look at a shear zone in the lower crustal exposures in Norway, where all the strain is localized in a region where water infiltrated the lower crust. And we did the tricks that we do to look at the deformation textures in this rock. And what we came away with was an estimate of viscosity based on those techniques of something like 10 to the 20, or maybe a little bit bigger than that. This blue box outlines the estimated viscosity that Andy's analysis of geodetic data got for lower crust in Mojave. And then for comparison, this green line shows the predicted flow law for a rock like that at these conditions. And for me, the coincidence of these three things at these temperatures give an exciting kind of validation for the approach that we're using. So tying together not only the geophysical data, the lab data, but the geology to look at an integrated picture. And why I think that's so important is it gives me a lot of confidence to go and talk to Mark and Andy and say, hey, I think you can really use this law. If it doesn't fit the observation, maybe we're just completely missing the process and something else is happening. And maybe Andy would look at another area around Parkfield along the San Andreas Fault, and they would get a totally different estimate of what the stress state is based on triggering of these really small, low-frequency earthquakes. And so for me, you know, not only does the kind of work that we did provide a cool constraint on what is right, or what is probable, would be a better way to say it, but when it doesn't fit at all, then it really makes you question, well, what's going on in that area? Maybe something really different is happening. So I'll pass it back over. Let me see, I'll stop sharing and send it back over to Mark.
So one other question that came in that maybe this will be best to Andy is essentially thinking about similar type of analysis for the Ridgecrest earthquake last year in very similar area, and if essentially what would you expect to see based on what we did for Ridgecrest in comparison to our earlier analysis? Maybe you're already working on this, I don't know.
Yeah, so it's actually what I'm starting to do, and Greg and I have been talking about this, is the Landers and Hector mine occurred now 20 years ago. So we have more than double the data. And since that time, we've also had the El Mejor earthquake 2010 further south. And then you have the Ridgecrest. So certainly the Ridgecrest itself, we could, at this stage, what we would do, we could make predictions of what we'll see in the future, because you need quite a few years for this stuff to relax to get the deeper stuff. But I think it's great to go back and look at all of these and basically ask the question, if these are all basically olivine or quartzite or whatever is deforming under different conditions, you really should be able to come up with a flow law from the laboratory and simply apply it to the different conditions and get the right answer. In other words, we expect the viscosities to be very different in hot and cold areas, wet and dry areas, but there should be the same flow law, given differences in mineralogy, that actually work for all of them. So I think that's where we want to go next. What I like about Ridgecrest is we could work on the other earthquakes with a lot of time series and deformation recorded and such, and make a really good prediction of what we should see following Ridgecrest. And of course, you'll learn the most by making a forward prediction and then coming back and seeing how you did. So that's how I view the Ridgecrest right now, as it's kind of in an incubator over there, and it's going to cruise along for the next few years, and it would be nice to make predictions about where that would go.
Mm-hmm. I guess maybe this would be a useful time also for you could show, and then I can talk a little bit about the a study that we've been working on, but in terms of the interaction between the crust and the mantle, and you said just a second ago that you're looking for one flow law, but in a lot of cases, well, in the mantle as well as in the crust, you often have multiple phases present at the same time. And so how you deal with that in the type of models that you're running.
Yeah, so that's a good question too, because we have different phases, you have different mechanisms, but maybe there's some common things that are dominant. Like we have felt, for example, for a while, I don't know how Greg still feels about this, but that olivine, for example, in the mantle, if it's 70% olivine and it's the weakest mineral, then it doesn't really matter what else is there, that it's just olivine. And so to test that idea, can an olivine flow law basically explain what we see in the mantle regardless of other differences? Yeah, let me show you another picture. So this is a picture from a recent study that my group did. And actually, I'm going to go to the top of this paper just to get you oriented where we are. So this is the El Mejor earthquake. Let me get a little bit. Oops. Let's try to make this bigger. Okay. So just you can see we're down at the earthquake was just south of the Mexican border. Most of our GPS is to the north, but what's cool is the post-seismic area covers a very hot area with thin crust in the Salton Trough and a cold area in the Peninsula Ranges. So in this study, we came up with these two figures, this figure for this. On the right side, well, the top is the Peninsula Ranges, what we inferred for viscosity structure on the top right, and the Salton Trough is the bottom right. And the conditions, the deformation conditions of the two are on the left, so that you can see the two geotherms. The Salton Trough is a lot hotter. As a result, the viscosities are in general a lot lower, as you'd expect. But there's some cool things here. Well, first of all, notice that we're always worried about where the lithosphere-asthenosphere boundary is. In this study, in both areas, we concluded it was shallower than the seismic lithosphere-asthenosphere boundary based on shear wave velocities. So it raised the question, what are we really measuring here? And what this showed was that you could correspond the LABs, the various LABs, to different onsets of melting. Even in the Salton Trough, where we have a lower crustal flow because it's so hot, it corresponds with the onset of granite melting. So these are the types of things I want to get into, but back to the common flow law, you see the viscosity structures are very different between these two areas, primarily because of temperature, maybe because of water content as well. Can a single flow law explain both of these viscosity structures by just taking into account the fact they're in different environments? So that's kind of the direction I'd like to go in. And of course, I didn't apply flow laws in here. I just chose effective viscosities, but now apply flow laws, do the whole transient thing. Can we find out that that actually we don't need as many flow laws as we think, that maybe a good composite flow law in the lower crust, or maybe a couple of them, and one good one that primarily catches olivine is going to be good enough? Or maybe we'll find out that it's much more complicated and that you really do need a lot of different flow laws for different areas. But those are kind of the basic questions that I'd like to address.
Yeah, maybe it's a good segue. I can, let me share my screen real quick. If there are other questions, please just post them to the window and I'll make sure to get them out to everybody. Let's see. So in this context of a composite flow law, or really trying to understand viscosity structure in Southern California, actually, Greg and I had another collaboration with, in this case, Ali Yagut and a MIT Woods Hole Joint Program student, Isha Navarre, who's done some really interesting work trying to use seismic velocities to make predictions for crustal viscosity structure. And it's kind of a nice complement to that figure you just showed, Andy, because what Billy did was he took the approach of looking just at the crust in this particular case and saying, well, what if we look at a whole bunch of different crustal compositions and we try to make predictions of the mineral phases that would be present in those, and then calculate both the seismic velocity as well as the viscosity for each of those different compositions. And so he did this. He took a giant data set for different crustal major element compositions, and he calculated those. And that's what's shown here. So that kind of creates this database of viscosity on the y-axis. And then here is the silica content, and then plotted as a function of VS, VP, and the color codes here are by silica, and then in this case it's VP with color codes of VS. And the interesting thing about this is that you can you can start to build relationships between seismic velocities and viscosity. And so then what Billy did was he said, well, what if we took a, let me find the right figure here, a velocity map from the SCEC community velocity model for Southern California. So we know VP and we know VS. We can parameterize the heat flow into a temperature structure, and we can take the strain rates, and we can essentially use those then to make predictions for what the viscosity should be at each point, in this particular case at 25 kilometers depth. And that's what's shown here. So this is essentially a map of viscosity. Here, viscosity normalized to plagioclase viscosity at that same depth. And here again is a plot, in this case, of the stress that comes out of that viscous flow law as a function of temperature. And so what's interesting is if you actually look at all of the data points from his crustal structure here at different temperatures and compare those to different single phase flow laws, the dots are individual data points where he's estimated viscosity, again plotted on the y-axis, versus temperature from his temperature model. They're color-coded by that VP-VS ratio. And the best fitting flow law would be this black flow law here. And it is actually very close to feldspar for the lower crust. So it may be that in certain areas, you can actually start to move towards still using a single flow law. Now, what you can see is that, right, the viscosities are dominantly affected by temperature here, but at the same time, there is variability by at least one full order of magnitude around that. So there can be local variability due to potentially due to the development of fabric or variations in the chemistry of the rock that then generates variability in the mineral phases that are present.
Or even the presence of melt.
And that's right, and potentially the presence of melt, exactly, which is not shown here, right? That would be in addition to any variations we saw here. But what is really interesting in Southern California is that the last thing Billy looked at was how his predictions of where the brittle ductile transition is compared to the seismic aseismic transition based on locking depths. And so the red is showing the locking depth, and there's this relatively distinct change from a shallow locking depth to the east to a deeper locking depth to the west. And we kind of looked at that in comparison to predictions of the viscosity structures. So the plagioclase flow law is here. The granite flow law would look about like this if you just assumed a typical granitic sort of composition. Gabbro would sit here. If you compare these in the west, you end up seeing, so this figure shows depth. This is stress. These are the curves that, the predicted stresses that come out of these viscosity curves. And then this red thing is what, in a log space, the stress from just a frictional law would look like. And what's pretty interesting is that the western locking depths are pretty well explained by just a quartz, granite, dominated sort of, a granite gabbro kind of dominated rock. But in order to explain this much shallower locking depth to the east, you really have to move towards something that's just dominated purely by quartz. So quartz would be the dominant phase. It's the only way to kind of shift that brittle ductile transition up the shallow. And so that could be pointing towards a transition where you go from an aggregate of a bunch of phases combining to give you one kind of bulk flow law to something that is now just dominated by the weakest phase. And I think actually maybe it's worth Greg talking a little bit about that, because I know he's doing some experiments on exactly these questions about when you need to move towards actually figuring out what the topology of the different phases is, and when one weak phase will dominate the whole system.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point, is that the models that Mark was just showing were, actually, if you go back to the Billy's map of viscosity.
Sure, just a second.
It ties directly back into what Andy was just showing.
This one?
Yeah, because you see the higher viscosity and the deeper locking depth in the area around the peninsula ranges, a little south of there.
Here.
Well, that's the Sierra Nevada, but also
Yeah.
in there, yeah. And then in the Salton Trough, then you get the shallower brittle ductile transition and then associated lower viscosity. So consistent with, this was just inversion or a correlation, taking the velocity to the viscosity. It matched basically what Andy just showed for the in a broad sense of the viscosity structure and the rule of temperature. And so what Mark was getting at was the flow law kind of formulation that he's showing is taking an isotropic rock. But when it deforms, it develops a texture and can be much weaker if you have an alignment of weaker phases. And that there are quartzites in sedimentary and metamorphic rocks, but in a lot of areas, such as the lower crust of an arc or in the old Proterozoic or granitic crust in the western U.S., that the way quartz can become the dominant phase is by deforming something to high strain. And I don't know, one thing it might be worth noting, which is I think one of the most important implications of Andy's geodetic analysis, was that the transient response that he was seeing was in the mantle at high temperatures. And one of the things that's important about that is that it's not in the crust. And what that's telling you, right, is that for the stress change that the earthquake caused, you didn't really excite much change in strain rate in the crust. And one way of looking at that is that the viscosity of the crust is kind of high, but the stress must also be a kind of high, or you would see a change. But if the stress change is a small fraction of the total stress, you won't see anything. And that's consistent with the observations. In contrast, at greater depths, the small change in stress is similar in magnitude, maybe just one order of magnitude off of the background stress, and you actually see a big response. So there's kind of more, there's more than just, oh, this is what the viscosity of the mantle was that's in those analyses. And again, I think one of the biggest issues that people have with a lot of the post-seismic creep stuff is, what is it telling us about shear zones and post or after slip and things like that in the crust? And how is the crust talking to the mantle through that layer? And those are interesting questions too.
So maybe at this point, it would be worth the two of you reflecting a little. I mean, as we think about moving the modeling collaboratory forward, I think that it's very important to have not just the modelers sitting around modeling stuff and not talking with both people who work on the physics that go into the models, but also the observations. And I guess one question is, what kind of mechanisms, I mean, we were kind of lucky in that we had a convergence of two of us that were in the Woods Hole area and a third one who wanted to be on Martha's Vineyard, and for us, and so we were all in the right place. But, you know, more practically for when that doesn't always naturally converge, what can the modeling collaboratory from your all's perspective do to help enable these sorts of interdisciplinary collaborations?
Well, to me, you know, you're right. There was a getting us together was a requirement, right? You know, today, like this conversation we're having, it's not hard to get 3 or 4 people to sit at their desk for 2 hours talking to each other about a problem. And I think a lot of progress towards collaboration can be made by just having conversations like this on a problem that people want to solve. So if you have some subduction zone modeler crowd, what you're going to want to do is kind of isolate parts of the system that you want to study, and then get a relatively small group of people, maybe not 50, but 5 or 3, to discuss that. And you know, how you do that, you know, maybe a great way of starting it is doing a workshop where a bunch of people come and talk to that. And the workshops will create an environment where collaborations can nucleate based on the science. But a lot of times the workshops end up kind of getting the same crowd that already has been talking to each other. So it's always important to try to figure out a way to reach out to other groups of folks. And not just, I think it's hard often for someone that has a little bit different perspective to come in, give a keynote talk to a bunch of people that aren't experts in that area and expect a lot to come out of it, because that keynote speaker will undoubtedly get too much into the weeds about what they're excited about their own work. I don't know, that's not undoubtedly. Often the case is that person might go too much into the weeds. But you know, trying to get together in that kind of environment where there's more informal discussion and fewer presentations is a good place to start that. I think these kinds of video chats are a way of doing that. It would require someone that was kind of organizing it and thinking, oh, you know, we should really, we should get, you know, Andy and you know, maybe some folks who are studying earthquakes in the same area, and some folks are looking at seismic anisotropy, and start challenging each other about, you know, the assumptions we're making and things like that. I think that's a viable thing. The only issue is you can't, you know, there has to be kind of an interest in a common interest to make it happen, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this got started because we were all in the same area, and so chats were very easy. I really do like the idea of workshops that are very interdisciplinary, because like, I don't really want to go to a workshop of modelers. Then we're just like, I don't know, we're all pumping iron and, you know, seeing who's the best, right? But you go to a workshop where there's a few modelers and there's seismologists and rock squeezers and petrologists, and you know, if you organize that right, then you can really get a lot of questions going. I mean, I just wasn't even aware of flow laws and how things worked in the laboratory until I started visiting with Woods Hole, and now it's like, then the ideas started churning. So and certainly once you meet people and start discussing ideas and things like that, then these webinars but of course the just getting together and chatting at a distance like this is very productive. But I think the key is still, to get things started, you just got to get the right people in a room for a few days, you know, over lunch, over beers, talking about problems and seeing where interests overlap and where techniques might be able to coincide, and then things can really happen.
Yeah, I think I completely agree that there's a personal effect to it. And I think that it's also, for early career people, it's important to not be shy and be willing to go up and ask questions and come up and say, hey, I've got this idea, you know, even if it's talking to someone you think, oh, wow, they're a lot more senior in the field. They might not have thought of it before. They might have something that's really interesting to contribute. And so that's the way great collaborations kind of get going. So I think that if you look back at programs like the Margins program or the Ridge program, some of their most productive meetings were these theoretical institutes that they used to have, which did exactly what you guys are saying, which is bringing people from multiple disciplines together at the same time. So I do have one other question that came in from the chat room. Let me just read. So I think this is kind of to a comment Greg you made. Do you have any specific microphysical mechanisms in mind when thinking about the role of transient rheologic properties of the mantle, specifically on year-long timescales of post-seismic creep?
Yeah, so you probably don't want me to give my full answer on that, but specifically the kind of the two main ones are grain boundary sliding and the effect it has on setting up defect structures along grain boundaries, and then dislocation, nucleation, and interaction. So if you get down to the nuts and bolts of how the creep mechanisms work, what the steady state is about is setting up a steady state crystal defect structure. And whenever you perturb the steady state, that defect structure has to change. And often that leads to a more rapid strain rate initially before the new steady state is set up. And so, you know, one of the things that you can look at, you know, in the lab is, well, you know, when I change, if I do a test where I hold the stress constant and I change the stress suddenly, I don't immediately get to a new steady state. There's a transient response in there. And we can quantify that. And our job is to try to figure out the role of grain boundary sliding or dislocation interaction and things like that to produce those things.
So I have a question for you, Greg, based on, so, you know, as a modeler, parameters are good, but too many parameters are a problem.
Are bad, yeah.
Okay, so for a steady state flow law,
yeah,
you have an activation energy, you have a power law N, you have a pre-exponential A, you got, you know,
all these things.
Right, and which are mineral dependent, right? These are mineral dependent parameters. So when you go to the transient phase and things are happening faster though, can you still use, is it the same activation energy? Is it still same power law N, or do you need a whole nother set now? And your answer is about to tell me how difficult my job's about to get.
Yeah. So for the grain boundary sliding process, you're lucky because the parameters probably don't change really. The temperature dependence and stress dependence don't change. The grain size dependence can change, but you know, you have to do what you can. For the dislocation creep process, it's not as clear actually, but you know, in order to make the algebra easy in the paper we did a long time ago, we assumed that the temperature dependencies and stress dependencies were the same, which made it much easier to parameterize. And we were lucky in that case because there was one kind of early paper from the 80s that suggested that for dislocation creep. So the reason why it might be more complicated and make your, I mean, when you have too many parameters, then you're just kind of, you have to worry that you're over parameterizing things. But the reason why the transient response can be different than the steady state response for dislocation creep is the same reason that the flow law is responding to a slow process in the system, but the anisotropy you see is responding to an easy process in the system, right? So in a rock, like let's make it simple and just make it olivine. Don't make it a rock. Just make it dunite. It's a dunite. And a dunite, the olivine is anisotropic, and so the defects move with different viscosities for different orientations in the crystal. And in order to make the crystal deform as a unit, or the rock to deform as a unit, you need all of those slip systems active. For the long-term deformation, the strain rate is limited by the hardest ones, but the anisotropy is set up by the easiest ones. It's possible that the transient response is set up by the easiest ones too. So that's that's another reason why it's possible that the transient viscosity is so much lower.
So related to that, a question that just came up is, what's kind of the time scale where you go from the longest time scale where you'd expect these transient creep phenomenon? For example, post-glacial rebound was the question. Would that potentially experience transient? And so when can you say it's transient and when do you just say it's steady state?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you know, that was one of the things I asked Andy like 2 months ago or something. Hey, Andy, that Mojave, you have a whole bunch more data. How does it look for the transient rheology? But in general, it depends on two things. One is what's driving the deformation. So in the post-seismic creep and the glacial rebound, you change the stress, and then that stress relaxes, right? So you perturb the stress, and then that stress relaxes. So you're kind of chasing a steady state for a longer time, and the rate of that diminishes with time because you're getting closer to the steady state. If instead you have just an abrupt change in stress, the transient will be much smaller. So in the lab, we can say, all right, keep the stress constant and then increase it by 10% and hold it constant at that new value. And those transients can be really short, and because they have the same kind of driving potential, it's easier to understand the kinetics. But rule of thumb is, you know, for a lot of these systems, 1% strain is a lot. So the transients that Andy's looking at, I don't remember, your strain rates are pretty small to begin with. So the transient strain is like 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 3 or something like that of strain. So, you know, if you in the person who asked the question was probably familiar with the Maxwell time. So in the post-glacial rebound, you're talking about viscosity that's 10 to the 21. So that's going to be roughly 2 orders of magnitude longer than the mantle response. But then you also have to ask, what was the stress change as well?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was like a way longer answer to that question instead of 3 years. No, but you know that's not right for the glacial rebound.
Well, I think I haven't seen any more questions come in, and I think we've been about our 1 hour. So maybe this would be a good time to thank both Greg and Andy for their time in talking about this. And I'm sure that if anyone does have any questions, they would be more than happy to have an email dialogue about them moving forward. And maybe I'll just turn it over to Gabe if he has any final comments on the webinar.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us in the audience and thank our panelists again. The next one in the series will be March 17th. You can go to our website for more details. We'll post the video for this online in the next couple weeks. So for anyone who missed it, feel free to share this conversation. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.